On a quiet summer afternoon in St. Mary Mead, beneath the hush of lace-curtained windows and the murmur of polite conversation, a single act of vanity would awaken a secret buried for generations. In a world of tea trays, whispered judgments, and roses heavy with memory, truth glimmers faintly, like a pearl waiting to be found beneath the dust of respectability. Where in the world are you tuning in from today? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Now, let's step together into the mystery of the vanishing pearl. It was one of those languid afternoons when time itself seemed to doze in the gentle hum of conversation and china. Lady Bantry presided over her tea table, with a mixture of pride and self-importance, for she had saved her finest revelation for the moment the conversation began to flag. With a soft rustle of silk, she drew forth a small velvet box, opening it with deliberate care. Nestled within lay a brooch of singular beauty, a large pale pearl encircled by delicate diamonds, the sort of jewel that carried whispers of lineage and scandal alike. Her guests leaned closer, murmuring their admiration. Lady Bantry's eyes sparkled as she spoke of the Georgian Duchess, who had once worn it, and the generations who had guarded it since. Yet even as she basked in admiration, the pearl caught the light strangely, almost coldly, as though aware it was being admired too much. Among the gathering sat three figures of interest. Mr. Linton, the antique dealer whose keen eyes measured worth more accurately than sentiment. Peter Wade, the young artist with restless hands and an expression of yearning he could scarcely disguise. And Alice Gray, Lady Bantry's maid, dutiful in posture yet with a flicker of longing that betrayed her restraint. Each looked upon the brooch differently, one with calculation, one with creative wonder, and one with quiet envy. A wordless current ran through the room, binding admiration to desire. The brooch, so innocent in its polished glow, seemed to reflect the secret thoughts of all who gazed upon it. Only Miss Marple, half hidden in her chair, noticed how even beauty, when placed before too many eyes, could invite trouble. Seated quietly near the window, Miss Marple appeared entirely absorbed in her knitting. Yet behind her mild eyes she was observing with the precision of a watchmaker. She noted how Lady Bantry's hand lingered on the brooch, unwilling to let it rest, how Mr. Linton's compliments contained the faintest air of possession, how the maid's fingers trembled as she served. To others these were trifles. To Miss Marple they were the vocabulary of human weakness, pride, greed, and envy cloaked in civility. She said little, merely remarking upon the unsettled weather, and how it often made people behave oddly. Her comment passed unnoticed, though the air itself seemed to grow heavier, as though anticipating some quiet disturbance yet to come. By late afternoon, the day had turned oppressive, the air thick with the promise of rain. A dark line of clouds pressed against the horizon as conversation grew stilted. The laughter that had filled the room only an hour earlier now faltered beneath distant rumbles of thunder. Lady Bantry, never fond of storms, insisted the windows be closed, and the pearl was swiftly returned to its velvet case. The first drops pattered against the panes, steady and deliberate. Within the dim drawing-room, faces appeared paler, eyes more reflective. Even Mr. Linton's confident chatter waned. Somewhere in the distance a shutter banged loose, startling Alice, who dropped a cup and blushed furiously. Miss Marple looked up, serene and watchful, as if she'd been expecting the storm, both inside and out. When the morning came, it brought neither the freshness nor relief one might expect after rain. The air hung damp and listless, the garden glistening but somehow subdued. Lady Bantry's shrill cry broke the quiet. Her pearl brooch had vanished. The dressing-room door had been locked, the key still in its drawer. Windows were secured, or so it seemed. The household stirred with confusion and whispered speculation. Colonel Bantry, summoned in haste, muttered about thieves and police reports, while Alice stood pale and trembling, protesting innocence to a room that had already judged her. Miss Marple, arriving under the pretext of concern for Lady Bantry's nerves, said very little. She simply looked around the room, her eyes taking in every detail, as though searching not for the jewel, but for the story it meant to tell. By the open window lay a single rose, its stem broken, petals bruised by rain. A few glistened against the sill, mingling with a faint trace of dust disturbed. On the carpet nearby, the clasp of the brooch, delicate, silver and snapped, lay like the ending of a sentence too abruptly finished. The inspector, once summoned, was quick to proclaim a common theft, a burglar emboldened by storm and darkness. Yet Miss Marple's expression remained unconvinced. Her gaze rested not upon the latch or the lock, but upon the fallen rose, the way it leaned, the faint mark it left upon the sill. "How curious," she murmured softly, almost to herself. No one asked what she meant, but her eyes held the look of someone who had already seen the first thread of a very human pattern begin to unravel. Lady Bantry had always believed that a well-arranged gathering could do wonders for the reputation of a household. It was not merely hospitality, it was an art. The late afternoon sun touched the lace curtains with a pale warmth as she inspected the drawing-room, ensuring that every cushion, every silver spoon, and every flower in its vase proclaimed refinement. The centrepiece, of course, was the small velvet case upon the side table, a promise of admiration yet to come. She paused before it, smiling faintly at her own reflection in the glass. The brooch had been her mother's pride, a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds, the kind of jewel that demanded both discretion and envy. Tonight she would display it once more. It was not vanity, she told herself, merely tradition, and tradition, in Gossington Hall, was an inherited obligation. As she rang for Alice, she felt that faint, delicious flutter which precedes the entrance of guests and the beginning of small, perfect dramas. The first to arrive was Colonel Melchett, punctual and expansive, his voice booming through the hall as though even the furniture ought to stand to attention. He was soon followed by Miss Hartnell, brisk, pink-faced, and already armed with 3 separate pieces of gossip, each more scandalous than the last. Their chatter filled the space until Mr. Linton entered, smooth, precise, and faintly perfumed with the air of commerce. He bowed to Lady Bantry with a grace that seemed slightly rehearsed. Alice Gray moved silently in their midst, refilling teacups and rearranging napkins, her quiet presence almost invisible. Yet there was a flicker in her eyes that belied the calm of her hands, a restlessness born not of duty, but of discontent. She was observant, that girl, perhaps too observant for her own good. And when Miss Marple arrived last, polite and unassuming as ever, no one paid her particular heed. But Lady Bantry, who had invited her out of courtesy, could not have known that the keenest eyes in the room belonged to the quiet spinster seated near the fire. When conversation turned to family heirlooms, Lady Bantry's expression lit with triumph. She produced the velvet case with the reverence of a priest unveiling a relic. Gasps of appreciation followed as the lid lifted to reveal the luminous pearl, creamy, deep, and impossibly perfect beneath its circle of light. Mr. Linton leaned forward, his expert's fingers poised just shy of touching the piece. "Exquisite Georgian work," he murmured, his tone reverent yet tinged with something acquisitive. He praised the craftsmanship, the rarity, the lustre, each word a subtle caress of temptation. Alice stood behind her mistress's chair, her gaze fixed not upon the pearl itself, but upon the delicate clasp that held it, a glance sharp, swift, and oddly personal. For her, the jewel represented not art or lineage, but something unattainable, a reminder of her position. Peter Wade, the young artist invited to sketch the gardens, admired it too, though differently. To him the brooch was not wealth, but inspiration, a thing of light and symmetry. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, looked from face to face with gentle amusement. She had seen the same expression before. Adoration mingled with greed, innocence shadowed by envy. It was, she reflected, a most dangerous combination. As the tea was poured and the conversation resumed, the air within the drawing-room grew warmer, denser with words unspoken. Lady Bantry basked in the attention, telling the story of how her grandmother had worn the pearl at a court reception. Miss Hartnell, feigning interest, inwardly calculated what such a jewel might fetch in London. Mr. Linton's remarks remained impeccable, but faintly patronising. His expertise allowed him the subtle cruelty of condescension. He spoke of restoration and value, of hidden flaws unseen by the untrained eye. Lady Bantry flushed slightly. Was he suggesting imperfection? Alice's hands trembled once as she placed a cup on a saucer, the faintest rattle cutting through the hum of voices. Colonel Melchett made a genial remark, but it landed awkwardly, its cheer failing to mend the thinning thread of ease. Only Miss Marple, quietly attentive, seemed undisturbed. She observed how pride and envy danced their delicate waltz around the table. She noticed how laughter rose a note too high, and how eyes lingered a shade too long. By the time the clock struck 6, the atmosphere had shifted almost imperceptibly, from civility to strain, from pleasantry to performance. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the truest confessions rarely came through words. They lay instead in posture, in the timbre of a voice, in the fleeting shadows that crossed a face before thought could intervene. She sat back, knitting softly, her needles moving with steady rhythm as her mind catalogued each tiny gesture. Lady Bantry's pride, she noted, was not vanity alone, but the brittle kind born of insecurity. Mr. Linton's courtesy was too polished, suggesting a man more accustomed to persuasion than sincerity. Miss Hartnell, though outwardly moral, delighted a little too eagerly in speculation. And Alice, well, there was defiance in the set of her shoulders, and perhaps even envy behind her lowered gaze. Peter Wade, meanwhile, seemed adrift in his own reverie, sketching absent-mindedly on the back of an envelope, his eyes returning to the brooch with an expression not of greed, but fascination. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She had no wish to judge, only to understand. In the delicate clockwork of human nature, one misplaced cog could set all others trembling. And somewhere within this comfortable company, she sensed the faintest tremor already beginning. By the time the first peal of thunder rolled across the sky, conversation had thinned to polite fragments. The air grew heavy, pressing close upon the company as lightning flashed distantly. Lady Bantry declared that the weather was most inconvenient, and Alice was dispatched to secure the windows. Mr. Linton glanced at his watch with regret he did not truly feel, for the rain would keep him under Lady Bantry's roof, and near her jewel a little longer. Colonel Melchett attempted to revive spirits with anecdotes of India, while Miss Hartnell muttered about the unnatural state of the climate. Miss Marple merely folded her knitting and looked out into the dim garden, where the first drops streaked the glass like tears. The house seemed to hold its breath as wind clawed at the shutters. Cups trembled on their saucers, conversation ceased altogether, and when a sudden crack of thunder shook the very walls, Lady Bantry gasped, clutching instinctively at her velvet box. Miss Marple, calm as a Sunday vicar, watched the flicker of unease move across each face in turn. "A pity," she murmured, almost to herself, "that storms have a way of bringing hidden things to light." The tranquillity of Gossington Hall was shattered by a cry so piercing that even the sparrows in the eaves fell silent. Lady Bantry's voice, usually so well modulated, rang through the corridors in unrestrained alarm. Within moments, the household had gathered upon the landing, each face reflecting a different shade of curiosity or guilt. The cause of the commotion was swiftly revealed. The pearl brooch, the pride of the Bantry lineage, had disappeared. The small velvet case, placed only the evening before upon her dressing table, now lay open and accusingly empty. Lady Bantry, in a state of distress, demanded explanations no one could provide. The servants exchanged glances. The guests murmured their astonishment. It seemed unthinkable that theft could have occurred within such a respectable house. Colonel Bantry, looking flustered in his dressing gown, muttered about sending for the police, while Miss Hartnell whispered that it must be the maid. Such girls are never quite trustworthy. Only Miss Marple, composed and thoughtful, stood a little apart, her gaze resting not upon the missing jewel, but upon the open window that had been left slightly ajar. There was, she reflected quietly, something altogether too deliberate about the disorder. When Colonel Bantry examined the situation more closely, the matter grew even more peculiar. The dressing-room door, it seemed, had been found locked from within. The key, polished, harmless, and unmistakably ordinary, had been discovered in its accustomed place inside the drawer of Lady Bantry's bureau. No sign of forced entry presented itself, and the windows, though open, bore no trace of tampering. The room itself held the faint scent of lavender and rain-soaked roses from the night before, an oddly innocent fragrance for a mystery so unsettling. A drawer had been slightly displaced, a brush knocked aside, subtle touches that suggested human presence but not hurried intrusion. Lady Bantry, though determined to appear composed, grew visibly pale each time her eyes strayed to the vacant space where the brooch had rested. "A locked room," Colonel Bantry declared with grim satisfaction, as though pronouncing a verdict. "An impossibility, which means—" Miss Marple, who had been tracing the pattern of a faint mark near the sill, finished his thought softly in her mind. Impossibilities were often the result of tidy thinking applied to untidy behaviour. She noticed, too, the faint glisten of something oily upon one window latch, a detail others might overlook. It was, she felt, the sort of touch that belonged not to a thief, but to someone wishing to be mistaken for one. Alice Gray stood before her mistress in a state of trembling composure that betrayed her inner turmoil. Her usually neat hands twisted the edge of her apron as she protested, with every appearance of sincerity, that she'd never entered the dressing room since the previous evening. "I laid out your things as usual, my lady," she said in a strained voice, "and locked up before the storm began." Lady Bantry's expression softened only slightly. She was, after all, a woman who believed deeply in both order and appearances. To lose a family treasure was bad enough. To suspect her own maid of deceit was infinitely worse. Colonel Bantry remained unconvinced. He had served long enough to recognise fear when he saw it, and Alice's nervous glances did not help her case. Yet Miss Marple, observing from a quiet corner, noted something curious. The girl's agitation was not that of guilt, but of desperation, more like one terrified of implication than one burdened by crime. Alice's gaze flickered once toward the window and away again, too quickly to be casual. Miss Marple's mind filed the gesture neatly beside the oiled latch and the faint scent of roses. She murmured a few gentle words of comfort, which Alice accepted with visible relief. It was, Miss Marple thought, the relief of someone who had not stolen anything, but had seen something she ought not to have seen. By mid-morning, Colonel Melchett had summoned the local authorities, and with the punctual solemnity of a stage queue, Inspector Slack arrived. His presence filled the room in a manner quite out of proportion to his stature. There was an air of brisk certainty about him, as though all mysteries were puzzles best solved through blunt persistence. He questioned the servants with the manner of a man convinced that guilt could be bullied into confession. Alice Gray bore the brunt of his inquiry. Her hands clasped tightly as she repeated her protestations. Mr. Linton, the antique dealer, was next. His indignation at the implication of suspicion was almost theatrical, though his eyes flicked more than once toward the empty case. Miss Marple observed the proceedings in silence, knitting resting idly in her lap. She noted how the inspector's attention skipped too quickly from person to person, missing the smaller truths concealed in tone and hesitation. It was not evidence he lacked, but imagination. When the interview concluded, he declared confidently that the matter was simple. An inside job, nothing more. Lady Bantry accepted this pronouncement with relief she did not quite believe. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple's eyes fell once more upon the faint mark of oil along the window latch. Her fingers brushed a thread of pale silk caught upon the carpet. It was delicate, nearly invisible, yet it gleamed faintly, like something quietly waiting to tell its story. Later that morning, when tempers had settled into polite disquiet and the inspector's presence was reduced to echoes of officious footsteps, Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall bearing a small bouquet from her garden. It was, she explained, a modest offering, some early pink roses and a sprig of thyme for steadiness of spirit. Lady Bantry, pale but determined, received her with weary gratitude, insisting that the matter was being handled most thoroughly. Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic, her eyes wandering with the soft aimlessness of one who simply admires a well-kept room. Yet there was nothing idle in that gaze. It rested briefly on the window latch, catching the faint sheen of oil glistening in the morning light, a small domestic detail that felt oddly out of character for Lady Bantry's meticulously ordered habits. On the sill, among a scattering of dew-stained petals, a trace of crushed rose lingered, its stem broken, its fall too deliberate for chance. Miss Marple's mind, sharp and tender in equal measure, turned over the image as if it were a memory rather than a clue. When Alice Gray entered with the tea-tray, Miss Marple's polite chatter never faltered. though she noted the faint tremor of the girl's hand and the way her gaze skirted the very window she herself had been admiring. As she left, Miss Marple placed the flowers gently upon the dressing table. The scent of the roses mingled with that faint note of oil, beauty and deceit intertwined, each disguising the other. And in her calm, unhurried way, Miss Marple began to understand that theft was rarely about jewels alone. By evening, the affair of the vanished pearl had become the chief topic of conversation not only within Gossington Hall, but across St. Mary Mead. Motives, like weeds, seemed to sprout wherever curiosity took root. Colonel Melchett spoke firmly of the maid's opportunity. Miss Hartnell, in hushed tones, declared it must be the antique dealer. Men who handle valuables all their lives can hardly resist temptation. Miss Marple listened to all with her customary patience. She knew that in every speculation there lingered a morsel of truth, however distorted. Alice Gray's resentment, for instance, was not imagined. Ambition can so easily turn bitter when brushed against wealth. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, envy alone seldom leaves window latches oiled. Mr. Linton's interest had been unmistakable, his admiration for the brooch tinged with covetous appreciation. Yet he had money enough, and pride too delicate for petty crime. As for Peter Wade, his admiration for Lady Bantry herself was of the kind that makes a young man foolish, but not necessarily dishonest. Still, the pattern was forming. A theft without force, a room locked, a rose misplaced, and a thread of silk pale as a sigh, all pointing to something done with deliberation rather than panic. Miss Marple sat that evening by her window, her knitting folded neatly beside her. Somewhere in the garden below the faint scent of roses drifted on the air. It reminded her curiously of an old case, a matter of pride disguised as justice, and of truth concealed beneath courtesy. The parallels were too precise to ignore. And as dusk deepened, she realized with quiet certainty that whoever had taken the pearl had not done so for profit, but for remembrance. By the next morning, the scandal had settled itself neatly into the teacups of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell, both sworn protectors of village morality, found themselves discussing the disappearance of Lady Bantry's pearl brooch with a relish that bordered on civic duty. Between sips and sighs, the tale gained shape and polish, just as pearls do under friction. Mrs. Price Ridley was quite certain it must have been the maid. "That one with the pale face," she said gravely, "the kind that reads novels and thinks herself above her station." Miss Hartnell disagreed. "Mark my words, it's that dealer, Mr. Linton. Those London types can't resist temptation, however cultured they sound." Each added detail became fact through repetition. The oiled latch became proof of premeditation, the scattered petals a sign of deceit. Even the thunderstorm was recruited to the story, a convenient cloak for sin. And as the two women exchanged theories with the gentle satisfaction of gardeners comparing dahlias, truth itself became secondary to the pleasure of telling. Yet somewhere beneath the layers of exaggeration, a few genuine threads remained, faint but intact. Miss Marple, in her quiet parlour not far away, had already been told the tale 3 different ways before luncheon. To her, the variations were not confusing, but instructive. It was always worth noting not what people said, but what they chose to omit. By midday, the story had escaped the confines of sitting rooms and shop counters, and taken on a life of its own. St. Mary Mead thrived on the currency of conversation, and this new scandal paid handsomely. Garden gates creaked with confidence shared, and washing lines fluttered above whispered speculation. The antique dealer, Mr. Linton, became a figure of suspicion. Some recalled his refined manners as too polished to be honest. Others spoke of his previous visits, each embellished with darker undertones. Alice Gray's name passed from mouth to mouth, her every gesture reinterpreted as evidence. Even Peter Wade, who had seemed harmless, was mentioned in connection with artistic temperament, which in the eyes of the village was perilously close to moral instability. Truth was not so much pursued as embroidered. By evening, what had begun as a mystery of theft had expanded into something grander, a small moral drama in which everyone had a role. Through it all, Miss Marple listened, not with indignation, but with patience. Gossip, after all, was like dust. It settled everywhere, and yet with enough sunlight it could reveal the shape of what lay beneath. It was during a quiet afternoon at the vicarage that Miss Marple first heard a fragment worth more than idle chatter. Mrs. Price Ridley, flushed with the satisfaction of privileged knowledge, mentioned that Mr. Linton had visited Gossington Hall some months before to appraise a collection of rare books. The statement was delivered carelessly, but to Miss Marple it sounded rehearsed, as though repeated from a source that had not meant to share it. Her mind turned over the detail. Lady Bantry had mentioned no such visit. Why books, when Linton dealt exclusively in jewels and fine silver? Such incongruity, Miss Marple knew, was rarely accidental. Later, over tea with the vicar's wife, she gently confirmed that a similar rumour had reached other ears, though with slight variations. Some said it had been a single visit, others claimed two. But the impression was clear. Mr. Linton had reason to be familiar with the layout of the house. As she folded her napkin, Miss Marple considered the significance of a man revisiting a place not for business, but for something left unfinished. She thought again of the oiled latch, the rose petals, the thread of silk. People do have a way, she murmured to herself, of returning to the scenes of their small vanities. That same afternoon, Peter Wade was seen once more in the gardens of Gossington Hall. The Bantrys, weary of the commotion, had left him to his sketches. They found comfort, perhaps, in his mild manners and nervous smiles. Yet Miss Marple, strolling past on her way to the churchyard, regarded the young man with quiet curiosity. He was seated near the rose beds, pencil moving uncertainly across his paper. Every few moments, his gaze darted toward the house, then quickly away. His restlessness betrayed something more than artistic intensity. It was the unease of someone conscious of being observed, even when no one appeared to watch. Miss Marple paused to admire the roses from a polite distance. She noticed one bloom with a broken stem, its petals bruised at the edge. He had chosen to sketch that very flower, though its beauty was marred. There was meaning in that choice. Artists, Miss Marple knew, revealed their truths not through words, but through what they lingered upon. She saw in his trembling hand both guilt and tenderness, a conflict as visible as ink upon parchment. As she continued her walk, the faint perfume of roses lingered behind her, sweet but sorrowful. The scent always clung longest to those who tried hardest to forget. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, the soft tick of the clock mingling with the rustle of knitting wool. The day's impressions settled gradually into thought. The tale of the vanished pearl, the nervous artist, the ambitious maid, each piece drifted through her mind like a leaf upon water. Then, quite suddenly, she remembered another story. It had been years ago, an incident in a neighbouring village, a young woman accused of theft, a scandal hushed but never forgotten. The culprit, as it turned out, had not stolen for gain but to expose a wrong long buried. The resemblance was faint, yet unmistakable. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, altered very little with the passage of time, only the settings changed. She recalled the servant girl's face from that old tale, how she had smiled when found guilty, certain that truth would one day catch up with her judges. There had been roses then too, and a keepsake lost in the confusion. Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. The past and present were intertwining threads, and somewhere in that weave lay the meaning of the pearl's disappearance. It was not a crime of opportunity, but of remembrance, and remembrance, she knew, was the most dangerous motive of all. Night had deepened over St. Mary Mead when Miss Marple rose to draw her curtains. A faint rustle near the threshold caught her attention. Opening the door, she found a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with string in a manner both careful and hurried. No handwriting marked it, no name betrayed its sender. She carried it inside, untying the knot with steady fingers. Beneath the paper lay a single object, a pearl, large and luminous, gleaming faintly in the lamplight. For a long moment she regarded it, thoughtful rather than surprised. It was, she reflected, the gesture of someone torn between guilt and conscience, a message left not for possession, but for absolution. The pearl, once a symbol of pride, had become instead an offering of peace. Miss Marple replaced it gently upon the table beside her knitting. The mystery was far from solved, yet its heart had begun to reveal itself. Somewhere in the village remorse was stirring, and remorse, when awakened, always found its way home. The morning after the mysterious parcel appeared upon her doorstep, Miss Marple decided that a visit to the vicarage might prove both polite and informative. She carried with her a jar of quince preserve, an offering well suited to cover a purpose less domestic. The vicar's wife, who had a fondness for recollection, greeted her warmly and soon settled into the comfortable rhythm of reminiscence that so often accompanied tea and parish gossip. Between talk of bazaars and choir rehearsals, Miss Marple guided the conversation with the delicacy of one threading a needle towards the Bantry estate. It was then that the vicar's wife recalled a curious matter, an old letter kept among parish records, written by a former housekeeper of Gossington Hall to the vicar's predecessor. She fetched it with some ceremony, unfolding the fragile paper with the reverence of one unwrapping scandal. The ink, though faded, still bore traces of indignation. It spoke of a theft, a servant girl, and a pearl brooch, of singular lustre. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though her eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. The mention of a pearl could hardly be coincidence. She asked to borrow the letter, promising its safe return, and as she tucked it carefully into her handbag, she murmured something about how curious it was that certain stories, however old, had a way of rising again, like roses blooming from long-buried roots. That evening, in the lamplight of her sitting-room, Miss Marple read the letter with quiet attention. It was written by a Mrs. Hayter, housekeeper to Lady Bantry's grandmother, whose tone conveyed outrage tempered by loyalty. According to the account, a maid named Clara Weston had been accused of stealing the family's cherished pearl brooch after it vanished one winter evening. Despite her protestations, the girl was dismissed without reference, her reputation ruined. No charges were brought, for Lady Bantry's grandfather had preferred to avoid public embarrassment. Yet within weeks, the brooch was miraculously recovered, found tucked among the folds of a shawl in the dressing-room. The family had quietly reclaimed it, claiming that no harm had been meant. The letter concluded with Mrs. Hayter's reflection that truth and justice seldom occupy the same parlour. It was a phrase that lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after the reading. She sat very still, considering the peculiar symmetry between past and present. The brooch had vanished again, as though repeating its history. And Clara Weston, a forgotten name, a silenced voice, might yet have descendants near enough to remember the wrong. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Alice Gray, whose manner had borne the unmistakable restraint of one raised on quiet resentment. Blood, Miss Marple mused softly, has a way of keeping accounts, even when families do not. The following day, Lady Bantry called upon Miss Marple under the pretext of seeking reassurance, though her composure betrayed unease. The disappearance of her brooch had revived whispers she had hoped long extinguished. Miss Marple, ever tactful, steered the conversation with gentle civility until the older woman, pressed by her own conscience, confessed that the Bantrys had once suffered a similar embarrassment. She spoke haltingly of a maid dismissed in unfortunate circumstances, a matter buried by her grandmother's insistence that propriety must outweigh pity. The brooch had been quietly restored, yet no apology ever made. One does what one must for the family's name, Lady Bantry concluded, though her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple listened without reproach, only a mild sadness in her eyes. She understood too well how respectability, once stained, was often scrubbed so hard that the damage only deepened. The Bantrys had built their reputation upon silence, and silence, she knew, had an echo that never truly faded. As Lady Bantry departed, Miss Marple opened her small notebook and made a single note beside Clara Weston's name. Justice deferred. The phrase felt heavier than ink, carrying with it the weight of generations. She looked out upon her garden, where the last roses trembled in the autumn air. They reminded her of that half-wilted bloom upon the sill, a symbol, perhaps, of something crushed but not forgotten. The past, it seemed, had returned to claim its due. That night, Miss Marple sat awake long after the lamps had been extinguished across the village. The letter from the vicar's wife lay open upon her lap, its paper brittle but its meaning uncomfortably alive. She found herself thinking, not of the stolen brooch as it appeared now, but as it must have been all those years ago, gleaming coldly in candlelight as a frightened girl pleaded her innocence to deafened ears. It occurred to her that time had done nothing to dull the edge of that humiliation. Guilt, she thought, could be inherited as surely as property. Pride, too. And somewhere within Gossington Hall both were stirring again. The resemblance between past and present was too exact to be chance. The vanished brooch, the oiled latch, the tremor in Alice Gray's voice, these were not accidents, but the careful steps of someone retracing the path of injustice. She recalled Alice's quiet defiance, her unusual composure under suspicion, and thought again of the long-forgotten Clara Weston. A daughter, perhaps, or a granddaughter. The connection was unproven, yet the likeness of spirit felt undeniable. Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. The past, it seemed, had found its avenger, and vengeance in such hands was seldom loud. It was the sort of revenge born not of hatred, but of remembrance, a patient echo, answering across decades, and she knew, with quiet certainty, that the next sound it made would not be merciful. The following morning, Miss Marple made her way to Mr. Linton's antique shop under the most innocent of pretexts. She carried an old silver spoon in her reticule, ostensibly to inquire after its age and value, but her true purpose was as polished as the silver itself. Mr. Linton greeted her with exaggerated politeness, his manner that of a man too conscious of refinement to seem sincere. The shop smelled faintly of beeswax and old paper, an air of respectability carefully cultivated to conceal the quiet hunger of trade. Miss Marple listened to his practised compliments, allowing him to weigh the spoon, appraise it, and speak of craftsmanship in the reverent tones of a man describing virtue. Her eyes meanwhile moved to a glass cabinet near the counter, where a small collection of jewellery caught the morning light. Among the assortment lay a silver clasp, delicate, oval, its hinge finely wrought. It was, to her eye, identical to the one that had fastened Lady Bantry's pearl brooch. She said nothing, merely adjusted her spectacles and admired a porcelain figurine, but her mind was alert to every detail. The dustless surface of the clasp, the faint scratch across its back, the tiny smear of oil near the hinge. Mr. Linton continued his smooth patter, but Miss Marple noticed a flicker in his eyes, unease masked by charm. He was a man who knew too much about beauty's disguises. As she thanked him and took her leave, he bowed with impeccable grace, but the movement was stiff, as though concealing fear. Outside, Miss Marple paused. The air felt cooler, sharper. The clasp had told her nothing outright, yet in its silent gleam she sensed a truth already forming shape, a truth that could not remain hidden much longer. Later that evening, as twilight softened the edges of the village, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting untouched upon her lap. Her thoughts were not on stitches, but on human frailty. How pride and guilt so often danced together, each convincing the other that it was justified. The theft, she now understood, was never about money or possession. The brooch had been taken as a symbol, an act of remembrance, a gesture against silence. Whoever had planned it had done so not out of greed, but from a wounded sense of balance, an attempt to right what history had ignored. Yet, as Miss Marple reflected, revenge rarely brought peace. It merely transferred the burden, dressing old pain in new deceit. Alice Gray's pale, anxious face returned to her mind. The eyes too guarded, the posture too composed for innocence untouched. And yet there had been no malice there, only a quiet desperation that spoke of loyalty to something deeper than self. She thought, too, of Lady Bantry, gracious yet uneasy, haunted by ancestral guilt she could never name aloud. Between the two women stretched a thread of fate spun from class, pride, and silence. The pearl itself was only its glittering disguise. Miss Marple rose and glanced toward the small parcel resting still on her mantelpiece. The single pearl returned in secret. It gleamed softly, no longer a token of wealth, but of conscience. Not theft, she murmured to herself, but confession. And she knew that the confession, once fully spoken, would bring with it both sorrow and release, two things human hearts never truly separate. The following dawn arrived with a deceptive stillness, the kind that precedes the hour when the village begins to stir. Yet before the church bell had struck 7, the tranquillity was broken by a cry that carried across the hedgerows, a sound of genuine terror, not drama. Within the grounds of Gossington Hall, the gardener had stumbled upon something dreadful near the pond by the rose garden. There, lying face down among the reeds, was the body of Mr. Linton, the antique dealer. His hat floated a few feet away, its brim heavy with dew. For a moment the scene appeared pitiful rather than sinister, a gentleman undone by nature's indifference. But even as the gardener summoned help, unease settled over the estate. By the time Colonel Melchett and Inspector Slack arrived, Lady Bantry stood pale and trembling, murmuring that the man had dined with them not a fortnight past. His death seemed both improbable and intimate, like tragedy playing out in miniature. It was Miss Marple who, standing quietly by the vicar's wife, noted the incongruities, the damp upon the man's sleeve not matching the state of his coat, the faint smudge of blood near his cuff, and the stillness of a scene that seemed arranged rather than discovered. While others spoke in agitation, she gazed at the pond's surface, reflecting not only the roses but something darker, an echo of guilt too deliberate to be chance. Inspector Slack, with his usual brusque efficiency, pronounced it a regrettable accident. "Slipped during the night," he said, "perhaps a fainting spell or misstep." He pointed to the damp embankment, the muddied edge of the path, and the man's spectacles, found neatly beside a stone. It was, he asserted, the picture of misfortune. But the picture had details that didn't agree with itself. In Mr. Linton's right hand was clutched a single broken rose stem, thorns embedded in the skin. A curious token for a dying man to grasp, unless it had been thrust upon him, or torn away in struggle. The inspector dismissed it as one of those poetic accidents. Miss Marple, however, had learned that the poetry of death was rarely accidental. She recalled the rose garden on the night of the storm, the scattered petals, the oiled latch, the quiet scent of deceit. Roses, she reflected, had always been accomplices to secrets, disguising cruelty behind their perfume. Lady Bantry wept softly, insisting that Mr. Linton had been a man of taste and refinement, incapable of vulgar crime. Yet that refinement, Miss Marple knew, was the very kind that could hide desperation or guilt behind polished manners. The inspector gathered his notes, confident in his verdict. The crowd began to disperse, but Miss Marple lingered, eyes fixed upon the lifeless hand that still held the broken stem. "People seldom fall gracefully," she murmured, "nor do they die clutching symbols without meaning." When the body was at last carried away, Miss Marple's gaze fell upon the faint trail of footprints that led from the gravel path to the pond. They were shallow, evenly spaced, showing none of the slipping or staggering that an accident might suggest. Yet on Mr. Linton's shoes the mud was thick, uneven, clinging in a way that told a different story. She bent slightly, noting how the soil from his soles did not match the damp clay of the garden. It was darker, coarser, more like the earth from the wilder stretch beyond the rose beds. Someone, she thought, had taken care to move him here, to give the impression of a fall. It was an act of misplaced artistry, too neat, too arranged. And yet the detail most telling of all was the rose in his hand, a broken bloom, its stem snapped cleanly, as if the life it represented had been torn before its time. Her mind, calm and precise, began to weave the threads together, the servant's shame, the missing brooch, the antique dealer's greed. Motives interlaced like vines, but the pattern was not yet clear. When Inspector Slack later declared the matter closed, Miss Marple merely smiled faintly. Closure, she knew, was a comfort men gave themselves when the truth lay too quietly beneath the surface. As she turned away from the pond, the faint scent of roses followed her, a fragrance now touched unmistakably by death. Though the police were satisfied to call it misadventure, the village murmured otherwise. The death of Mr. Linton had cast a pall of unease over Gossington Hall, one that deepened when the household inventory confirmed what Miss Marple had quietly expected. The pearl brooch was still missing. The revelation knitted two threads into one. Theft and death now appeared, inextricably linked. And yet Miss Marple sensed that the connection between them was subtler than greed. The brooch, after all, had already been returned once before, in that small anonymous parcel. Its disappearance a second time suggested something more symbolic, perhaps a final act of possession or of release. Lady Bantry spoke of ill luck, of curses and family misfortunes, but Miss Marple's mind was occupied with human frailty, not superstition. She thought of Mr. Linton's eager admiration of the jewel, of his secretive manner, and of the quiet panic she had glimpsed in Alice Gray's eyes when told of his death. It was curious, too, that the rose garden, scene of both beauty and death, had become the silent witness to so much guilt. Roses, she reflected, had long been companions to secrets, their thorns reminders that beauty and pain were rarely apart. As the day waned, Miss Marple felt the mystery turning inward, its heart not in the lost brooch but in what it represented, a wound reopened after decades of genteel silence, and somewhere among the living, conscience was still bleeding quietly. Miss Marple possessed a gift that owed little to interrogation and much to patience. She believed that truth, like a seed, must be allowed to emerge in its own season. So she went about the village that week as usual, paying brief visits, attending to the parish meeting, and offering condolences with the delicacy of one who merely observes, not judges. At Lady Bantry's she noted how the hostess's voice quavered less from sorrow than from the discomfort of having her house linked to scandal. There was pity in her expression, but also relief that guilt might settle elsewhere. Miss Marple marked that carefully. Peter Wade, the young artist, had grown pale and withdrawn, his sketches abandoned, his eyes carrying the lost look of one who fears having seen too much. When gently reminded of his work in the rose garden, he shuddered, a gesture so involuntary that Miss Marple felt compassion rather than suspicion. Alice Gray, however, proved more difficult to read. Her grief seemed genuine, but her composure bordered on unnatural calm. When Miss Marple inquired after her future, the maid's answer was vague, her voice almost resigned. The girl's loyalty, Miss Marple decided, was neither to her mistress nor herself. It lay buried somewhere in the past. Among them all, guilt moved like an invisible draught, shifting expressions, tightening voices, and revealing what no words would say. When she returned home that evening, Miss Marple opened her notebook, jotting not names but qualities: pride, protection, and penance. She underlined the last. It seemed to her seasoned mind that the crime had been committed not to gain freedom, but to pay a debt that conscience would no longer carry. In the quiet of her parlour, Miss Marple reflected that truth rarely presented itself as revelation, but rather as something one recognised, familiar and inevitable once seen. The pieces at last aligned with dreadful clarity. Mr. Linton's death had not been murder for profit. It had been the desperate act of a conscience cornered by its own deceit. The antique dealer, she recalled, had known too much. He had recognised the clasp of the Bantry brooch and connected it to the scandal of years past. The servant girl, the wrongful accusation, the unatoned injustice. In discovering that Alice Gray was the descendant of that disgraced maid, he had seen opportunity. But in his greed to profit from guilt, he had misjudged the strength of retribution cloaked in silence. Alice had taken the brooch, yes, but not to sell it. She had wished only to restore the honour her family had lost. When confronted by Linton, blackmail had followed, pride against avarice. It ended by the pond, amid the roses, where a struggle, a fall and an accident of fear turned justice once more into tragedy. Miss Marple, though certain now, felt no triumph, only the sorrow of understanding too well the quiet crimes that pride commits. Some sins, she thought, are not punished by law but by memory. She looked once more at the single pearl resting on her mantle, its sheen soft in the lamplight. It seemed to her the very embodiment of the case, a thing of beauty born of irritation, its perfection hiding the pain that had shaped it. And as she folded her hands, Miss Marple whispered almost tenderly, "Poor child, she only wished to make the truth as spotless as the pearl itself." As dusk fell upon Gossington Hall, a hush seemed to descend that was not merely the doing of evening. At Miss Marple's gentle request, the household gathered in the drawing-room, a custom so familiar to the Bantrys that it felt almost comforting, though beneath the civility lingered a thread of unease. Lady Bantry sat erect, hands clasped too tightly upon her lap, while Colonel Melchett fidgeted in solemn discomfort. Alice Gray stood near the doorway, pale yet composed, her eyes lowered in quiet resignation. Miss Marple's demeanour was one of complete composure, her voice soft, her manner almost apologetic. She spoke as though explaining a matter of housekeeping rather than one of life and death. Yet behind the modest tone, there was a precision of thought that commanded silence. She began, not with the death of Mr. Linton, but with the smaller matter that had preceded it, the vanishing of the pearl brooch. "It is curious," she remarked, "how very often a crime begins not with wickedness, but with emotion." Her words were simple, but in the stillness they seemed to echo. The lamps glowed faintly as faces turned towards her, faces marked by apprehension, curiosity, and a certain weary fear. She glanced once at Alice, whose stillness was too deliberate. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that tonight we may set a few spirits free, those of the living, and perhaps of the wronged dead as well." The room seemed to tighten with expectation, like breath drawn and held. Miss Marple began with the beginning, tracing the thread of events as one might unravel an intricate piece of lace. She spoke of the evening when Lady Bantry displayed her family brooch, of the admiring glances, and of how admiration, when coloured by pride, can turn into temptation of another kind. "Vanity," she said gently, "is a small sin in itself, but when coupled with guilt, it tends to disguise what truly matters." Her eyes rested kindly on Lady Bantry, who flinched as though the remark had been personal. The theft, Miss Marple explained, had never been a theft in the vulgar sense. It was a performance, a deliberate act meant to call attention to something long forgotten. "You see," she continued, "the missing brooch was not about ownership at all. It was about memory, something far heavier to carry." She described how suspicion had neatly fallen upon Alice Gray, the servant most vulnerable to doubt, and how Mr. Linton's supposed discovery of the truth had made him dangerous not to the household, but to the conscience of one within it. Every detail, every whisper of scandal had concealed an older injustice beneath the plight embroidery of village life. Miss Marple spoke without accusation, her tone almost sorrowful, as though pitying the frailty of human nature. When she paused, even the ticking of the clock seemed hesitant. "The brooch," she concluded softly, "was never lost at all. It was taken to remind certain people that the truth, however inconvenient, never remains buried forever." A silence followed, sharp as glass. Miss Marple's gaze fell at last upon Alice Gray. The young woman met it without fear, though her hands trembled faintly at her sides. "It was you," Miss Marple said quietly, "who staged the disappearance. Not to steal, but to awaken a memory buried by others." The words were not an accusation. They were a release. Alice's composure wavered, and for the first time she spoke, her voice trembling with the weight of long-kept silence. She spoke of her mother, Clara Weston, once a maid in the Bantry household, dismissed under the cloud of a false accusation. She never spoke bitterly, Alice said, only sadly, but sadness, Miss Marple, can turn into purpose. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. She explained that Alice had discovered her mother's name within the old household ledger, proof of a past wrong unacknowledged. Taking the brooch had been her way of mirroring that injustice, to make the Bantrys feel, if only for a day, the stain of undeserved suspicion. Mr. Linton had uncovered her secret and sought to exploit it, using knowledge as a weapon. His death, Miss Marple said gravely, had come not through malice, but accident, an ending that neither cruelty nor forgiveness could have prevented. Lady Bantry's eyes filled with tears. Pride had been her inheritance. Remorse now became its companion. Miss Marple, ever tender, in victory spoke no further. She merely looked towards the darkening window and said, almost kindly, "Justice, my dear, wears many disguises." Miss Marple turned her attention to Peter Wade, who had remained silent throughout her gentle dissection of events. His nervous fingers toyed with a folded handkerchief, the only movement in an otherwise frozen composure. "You see," Miss Marple began softly, "young Mr. Wade was not merely a bystander in this little drama. He was, in his own fashion, an accomplice, though not a criminal one." The young man's eyes flickered with a mixture of shame and relief, as if some inner burden were at last acknowledged. Miss Marple continued without reproach. He had learned the story of Alice's mother and saw in the vanished brooch an opportunity to reveal an old wrong that polite society had chosen to forget. His photographs, taken discreetly, were not meant for beauty alone, but for truth. Peter had used his art to capture the brooch against the background of the Bantry crest, intending to publish it quietly with a note about the servant once accused. A symbolic gesture, Miss Marple murmured, meant to unmask pride through artistry. Yet his plan, though noble, had been perilously naive. He had not reckoned with Mr. Linton's sharp eye and sharper greed. The dealer had recognised both the jewel and its implications. What began as an attempt at reparation soon twisted into a secret worth exploiting. Miss Marple looked kindly at the young man. "You meant only to expose hypocrisy," she said, "but conscience, once disturbed, rarely keeps its boundaries." The truth, she sensed, had begun to tremble on the verge of tragedy. Miss Marple's voice grew quieter still, and the silence in the drawing-room deepened. "Mr. Linton," she said, "was a man whose livelihood depended on secrets, on knowing what others preferred hidden. When he realised the connection between Alice and the old scandal, he saw not an injustice to right, but a chance for profit." Her eyes rested briefly on Lady Bantry, who turned away in silent distress. "He confronted Alice in the garden that night," Miss Marple continued, "perhaps with threats, perhaps with the promise of discretion, for a price." The image formed, vivid yet tragic. A frightened girl clutching the brooch she had reclaimed as proof of her mother's innocence, and a man pressing too close, his greed outpacing his reason. The rose garden had been still except for the rain, and the argument, low, desperate, had ended as all reckless things do in chaos. "There was no intent to kill," Miss Marple said gently. "He seized her wrist, she struggled, the brooch fell. In his effort to recover it, he stumbled near the pond. The ground was slick, treacherous from the storm, one moment's imbalance, and it was over." Alice's eyes were fixed on the floor, her lips white. Miss Marple's tone remained kind. It was not murder, but fear, and the dreadful swiftness with which consequence follows action. She allowed the words to settle, their weight both merciful and grave. "And yet," she added softly, "though death came by accident, guilt came by choice. For concealment once begun becomes its own prison." Every face in the room reflected the same uneasy understanding. Even those innocent of deed felt complicit in silence. When Miss Marple finally spoke again, her tone had altered, no longer analytical but deeply humane. "Guilt," she said, "is a curious thing. It can hide beneath pride, behind duty, even within affection, but it never sleeps." Her gaze moved from one person to the next. Lady Bantry's posture had softened, her head bowed as if years of unspoken remorse had at last found a listener. Peter Wade looked stricken, his idealism bruised by the realization of what it had cost. And Alice, poor Alice, stood very still, her composure trembling like a candle before extinction. Miss Marple spoke not of blame, but of burden. "Your mother," she said gently to Alice, "was made to bear shame she did not earn. You believed that by repeating the story in reverse, by taking what had been unjustly taken, you would set her spirit free. But vengeance, my dear, is never the language of peace." Alice's eyes filled with tears, and her voice, when it came, was barely audible. She confessed not in words of guilt, but of love. How she had only wished to restore honour to a name buried by cruelty. The brooch, she said, had been meant as an offering, a truth returned to its rightful place. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression touched by quiet pity. "The past," she murmured, "is never corrected by repeating its mistakes. Only forgiveness can do that." Alice wept then, not for the dead, but for the years spent carrying another's sorrow. And as the clock ticked into the solemn silence, Miss Marple folded her hands and said, almost tenderly, "Let the brooch rest at last, where both pride and pain may sleep beside it." In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead resumed its quiet rhythm, as it always did after the tremors of scandal. The village had a way of absorbing tragedy into its gossip, polishing it into anecdote, and finally setting it aside like an old photograph. The talk at the grocer's drifted from the business of the brooch to the upcoming flower show, and Mrs. Price Ridley, who had once declared the affair a moral catastrophe, now referred to it as a regrettable misunderstanding. Miss Marple observed this return to normality with her usual blend of amusement and melancholy. She knew how swiftly human beings sought to restore comfort, how readily they closed the shutters on unpleasant truths. Yet beneath the restored calm she sensed something altered, a faint tenderness in the way neighbours greeted one another, as though tragedy had reminded them of their shared frailty. Lady Bantry, for her part, went about her duties with a subdued dignity. The grandeur of her household seemed slightly dimmed, though perhaps, Miss Marple thought, it had been replaced by something far more becoming: humility. The roses in the garden, recently the stage for secrets and sorrow, now bloomed as though eager to reclaim innocence. By the time the church bells tolled that Sunday, the storm, moral, emotional and otherwise, had truly passed. Yet Miss Marple, seated by her parlour window, reflected that peace, like innocence, was never permanent. It merely rested between the tempests that human hearts so quietly create. A week later, Lady Bantry made a quiet visit to the vicarage, carrying with her a small velvet box. She had asked Miss Marple to accompany her, though she gave no reason beyond the wish for moral company. The vicar received them both with a kind gravity that suited the moment, and when the box was opened upon his desk, the pearl within gleamed softly in the light, no longer a symbol of vanity, but of something redeemed. "It ought never to have been mine," Lady Bantry said simply. "Perhaps it never truly was." Her words carried the tremor of confession, but also release. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely inclined her head, understanding that for some, the act of giving back was the truest form of repentance. It was agreed that the brooch should be donated to the church, an offering to cleanse its history of pride and sorrow. The decision, quietly made, spread through the parish in whispers of approval. Even the most hardened tongues admitted that Lady Bantry had done the decent thing. When the brooch was placed upon the altar the following Sunday, Miss Marple thought it gleamed less with lustre than with forgiveness. The light upon it was soft and unassuming, an object finally at peace with itself. As they left the churchyard, Lady Bantry sighed that the roses would bloom soon again. "Yes," Miss Marple murmured gently, "and perhaps this time, without thorns quite so sharp." The remark lingered, half observation, half blessing. It was early on a misted morning when Alice Gray departed St. Mary Mead. No one saw her go save for Miss Marple, who had quietly risen to watch from her garden gate. The girl's figure, slight and solitary, moved along the lane with a small case in hand, her steps neither hurried nor hesitant. There was something in her bearing, grace tinged with resolve, that spoke of a spirit unburdened at last. Miss Marple did not call out. She understood that farewells, when truly felt, required silence. Yet as Alice neared the bend in the road, another figure joined her, Peter Wade, the young artist. He carried his sketchbook beneath his arm and offered a brief nod in Miss Marple's direction, almost shyly, as though acknowledging the unseen guidance that had led them both here. Together they disappeared beyond the hedgerow, two young lives stepping into the uncertain kindness of tomorrow. Miss Marple watched until the lane was empty, then returned indoors, her heart touched by the quiet satisfaction that comes only when justice and compassion have met halfway. Later that afternoon, she sat with the vicar's wife for tea, speaking lightly of weather and parish matters. Yet as the clock chimed, she glanced toward the window, where sunlight rested on the rose bushes. "Curious, isn't it," she murmured, "how even sorrow, when tended gently, blooms again as hope." And for the first time in many weeks, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, contented smile. That evening the vicarage was filled with the gentle hum of the kettle and the comforting scent of toasted bread. Miss Marple sat opposite the vicar, her knitting folded neatly beside her, the needles resting as though even they had paused to listen. The fire crackled in amiable counterpoint to the vicar's thoughtful murmurs about justice and providence, two concepts that in his view seldom arrived at the same hour. Miss Marple, however, smiled in her quiet way. She had learned long ago that truth, like a weed in a rose-bed, grew where it pleased, regardless of what tidy minds wished. "It is curious," she remarked softly, "how often the truth is the simplest thing in the world, and yet people contrive not to see it. Comfort, my dear vicar, can be the most effective blindfold." The vicar nodded, conceding that human beings preferred illusion so long as it remained respectable. He spoke of the tragedy's moral lessons, of repentance and redemption. But Miss Marple's mind was not on sermons. It lingered instead on human hearts, their frailty, their courage, their foolish longing to make right what life had already made crooked. As the fire settled into embers, she reflected that truth had, at last, been restored, not through punishment, but through recognition. The pearl had found its peace, and so too had those it had burdened. Yet she wondered, with gentle melancholy, how many more such truths lay hidden behind curtains of comfort across England's quiet villages. In the weeks that followed, the vicarage garden, long subdued by the damp of late spring, began to stir into renewed bloom. The roses, those faithful chroniclers of village seasons, seemed particularly abundant that year. Their petals opened with a grace that felt almost deliberate, as if nature itself had chosen to commemorate the quiet reconciliation that had taken root among the people of St. Mary Mead. Lady Bantry was once more seen at Sunday service, her manner humbler, her laughter softer. The scandal that had hung over Gossington Hall had faded into something nearly wholesome, a story of pride softened by repentance. Alice Gray's name, once whispered with suspicion, was now spoken with restrained pity and a hint of admiration. The brooch, gleaming from its new place in the church, had ceased to be an ornament. It had become a relic of reflection. Miss Marple took her morning walk through the vicarage garden as the dew clung to the roses. She observed that the blooms nearest the church wall were the richest in colour, deep as memory, tender as forgiveness. To her mind they were not merely flowers, they were continuations of all the human stories that passed through St. Mary Mead, small failures, greater kindnesses, the timeless exchange of folly and grace. As she lingered by the gate, she thought of the pearl now resting beyond the church window, catching the morning light. Its gleam, subdued yet enduring, seemed to echo the rose's message, that from pain, something gentler always grows. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple returned home. The sun, filtering through lace curtains, cast faint circles of light upon her parlour table, where her teacup and a folded letter lay waiting. Her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where a small token now stood, the photograph of the church altar, taken by the vicar's wife. In its centre, the pearl brooch glimmered faintly beneath the sunlight, its radiance tempered by time. Miss Marple regarded it with quiet satisfaction. There was something profoundly fitting about its new home. Once a symbol of vanity and wounded pride, it now adorned the house of prayer, purified not by ritual but by the courage of those who had suffered and repented. Beauty, she reflected, was rarely innocent. It was nearly always born of endurance. A pearl, after all, began its life as an irritation, a wound transformed through patience into something whole. Her thoughts drifted to Alice Gray, and the path she had chosen beyond the village, to Lady Bantry's softened heart, to Peter Wade's uncertain but hopeful devotion. Each, in their own way, had taken part in the strange alchemy by which pain becomes wisdom. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour with the calm finality of closure. Miss Marple reached for her knitting once more, the faintest smile crossing her face. For even pearls, she mused inwardly, are not created in calm waters, but in those that have known trouble and endured it with grace. And with that thought, she resumed her quiet work, while the last light of evening played tenderly upon the polished pearl in the photograph. In the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, life always seems to return to its gentle rhythm, yet beneath the calm, something eternal lingers. The mystery of the vanishing pearl wasn't just a tale of a stolen brooch or a death by the rose garden. It was a story about pride, forgiveness, and the long shadows cast by old wrongs. Miss Marple reminded us that truth doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes softly, through reflection, humility, and the courage to see what comfort has long concealed. In the end, it wasn't the pearl that was restored, but the hearts of those who learned to face their own guilt and grief. And yet, one question remains. Was Alice truly free when she left St. Mary Mead, or will the past, like the shimmer of that cursed pearl, follow her wherever she goes? What do you think? Can one ever truly escape the echoes of an old injustice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you feel that justice was served in the end? Or did Miss Marple uncover something that should have been left buried? Share your reflections. Your insights always bring these stories to life. If you enjoyed today's mystery, make sure to subscribe for more timeless tales of hidden motives, quiet confessions, and moral reckonings beneath the calm English sky. And do share this story with friends and family who love a good mystery, because as Miss Marple might say, every heart hides a puzzle waiting to be solved.